Thank you, Dick, for the kind introduction. I probably learned much more about Japanese politics from Dick Samuels than he would ever have learned from me, but I appreciate his kind words. And I also want to thank NBR and the Woodrow Wilson Center really for organizing this gathering. It's a remarkable event, and I'm really privileged to be a part of it. I think the question I want to start with is, why did the fate of a single helicopter base, which, by the way, currently houses about 25 helicopters, become the central issue in U.S.-Japan relations and lead to the downfall of a Japanese prime minister? It's the first Japanese prime minister to be forced to resign from office essentially over a security issue, although there were other obviously contributing factors, not least his own inept leadership, since Prime Minister Kishi was forced to resign in 1960 following the forced passage of the security treaty. So how did this come about? You have to start with Okinawa itself, and I'm not going to go into any detail on that. This is a problem. The issue of U.S. bases and their over-concentration on Okinawa is something that goes back decades and has been essentially unresolved, including by every LDP administration that's been in power for the last half-century. So that was the backdrop. So how did we get to this place? You can't explain it simply on the basis of Okinawa itself. I think first and most importantly is domestic politics, and domestic politics was the driver of this problem. And to an extent to which I think most American policymakers really almost refused to accept. The nature of the political transition in Japan was largely treated, I think, as a kind of version of political transitions that we see in the West, a shift of power from one party to another. And I think the kind of conversation I heard from people in Washington was, well, yeah, so they need a little time to adjust to, come into power and, go up the learning curve and so on. And they were looking for the usual kind of statements of continuity of policy that are reassuring to people when transitions take place. But that really understates the nature of what took place in Japan. This was in some ways, a kind of political revolution. It ended, after all, not only a half-century of almost uninterrupted single-party rule, but a system of governance itself, because the DPJ's target was not only to come to power, but to dismantle the structure of governance that had kept the LDP in power for a long time. That included, what some people call the Iron Triangle, the collusive relationship between the bureaucracy, the permanent bureaucracy in Japan, the press, the business community, and the politicians. The DPJ had very much in their minds the experience they had of a brief period in power in 1993-94, the Hosokawa cabinet, which was formed on as this was the case this time, on the basis of a coalition of parties, although the DPJ was a much more dominant party now than it was its predecessors were in 1993. And that government fell apart very quickly due to all sorts of factors, scandals, but mainly due to the resistance from the LDP and the bureaucracy, and because of the falling apart of that coalition very quickly. And there's a long history to that, but there were some lessons drawn from it by the people who were the leadership of the DPJ, including the Party Secretary General Ozawa Ichiro and the Prime Minister and others. They were determined to consolidate their rule, not just to come to power, but to, in some sense, drive a stake into the heart of the LDP and of the political system around it so they could sustain a long period of time in power. They were obsessed from the beginning with the elections they saw coming up ahead, including the upper house elections, which are taking place next month, because they saw this as a process of finishing the job and in the case of the upper house elections, of being able to consolidate a DPJ majority in the upper house without having to deal with its coalition partners. So all of these things were on their minds, heavily on their minds. At the same time, they were dealing with the reality that there was tremendous resistance to the advent of DPJ rule. And they had committed they had gotten themselves in a lot of trouble very early on due to the financial scandals, which had preceded the election, and to the growing perception, which was fed in large part, I think, by the base issue, that Hatoyama was an indecisive leader trying to keep together an undisciplined party. And there was a lot of, I think, truth to that. but it was also the case that all of these things tended to feed, even increasingly, their sense that they couldn't deviate from their domestic political agenda because they feared losing power. And I think that what you also see in Japan is the advent of competitive politics, which really hadn't been the case before. Elections are now much more competitive affairs in Japan. Voters are no longer locked into their party preferences in the way they were in the past. A large part of the Japanese electorate are what Japanese call floating voters now. They shift their allegiances from election to election. You can see it now reflected in the way that polls jump around extremely heavily. So that the DPJ was even more, I think, responsive to the shifting winds of public opinion than any previous Japanese government. And then on top of that, the channels of communication which existed between Japan and the United States and have been really the way in which foreign policy has been managed between these two allies for a long period of time, largely channels between the bureaucracy but also between certain long-time politicians in the LDP and counterparts here. Those channels of communication disappeared. The DPJ very early on tried to shut the bureaucracy out of the policymaking process. As a result, when problems arose, it was very difficult to find reliable routes of communication. And at the same time, I'd say the other factor that operated here was that people in the United States really didn't know who the DPJ was. For the most part, most of these people were unknown to the United States. Some of the top leadership of the DPJ had come out of the LDP, Hatoyama and Ozawa in particular, but much of the leadership of the DPJ, and we're now seeing the new cabinet that's been formed, is mainly composed of these people, actually have no history in the LDP. They either came out of the Socialist Party or the, broadly speaking, the sort of social democratic left in Japan, or they came out of civic organizations, other groups. They emerged in a totally different way. They don't have the same political culture, and they don't have the same lines of communication that have existed for a long time, and in some ways were the ways in which the alliance has been successfully managed over a long period of time. So I think all of this became painfully evident as we went through the emergent crisis over the Futenma Marine Air Station. I think what made this then even more difficult to manage was the perception in the United States and the advocacy by the DPJ of a shift in Japanese foreign policy, what I've called the new Asianism. It was, some people latched on to this notion of the desire to have a more equal relationship with the United States. I think that word probably is a little bit, it communicated much more than the DPJ really wanted to communicate, because in fact the DPJ leadership had not really thought through and was not that interested in taking on an equal share of the security burden. What they sought and what they talked about more was the idea that Japanese had to formulate their foreign policy by themselves. They no longer had to simply go on the basis of whatever it is the Americans wanted. You know, you say yes and you move along. That's a long discussion in Japanese foreign policy, but that was, I think, the underlying idea that drove that phrase, more equal relationship. But I think the more important part of it was the desire to focus much more on Japan's relationship with Asia, not just with China, but also with South Korea, with India, with Vietnam. The notion, I think the DPJ in many ways reflects a little bit of a retreat from the beginnings of a Japanese participation in global security issues, which we saw particularly under the Koizumi administration. Most of the DPJ leadership, people that I've talked to, they're not that interested in Japan playing a global role. I mean, they talk about it in terms of some of the sort of soft power issues like climate change, energy, and so on. But from a security point of view, and I think largely in every sense, they're focused much more on Japan's role in Asia. And that seemed to have struck a nerve with some people in Washington, because particularly when Prime Minister Hatoyama made these comments early in his cabinet about his desire to create an East Asian community modeled on the European Union, and when he appeared at the triangular meeting of the leaders of South Korea, Japan, and China in October of last year, and said, and this is a quote that's been rolled back many, many times, he says, "Until now, there's been a tendency for Japan to depend too much on the United States. while we still consider the alliance with the United States as being important, we also want to create policy that places more emphasis on Asia. And that struck many people as being almost obsequious towards the Chinese effort to distance Japan from the United States. And I think that those remarks keep getting cited along with other evidence that the DPJ is somehow pro-Chinese and anti-American in its orientation. I think that's a many ways misreading of the DPJ's foreign policy orientation. I mean, I would say several things. One is that the economic reality for Japan, as it is, for that matter, for everybody else in Asia and to a certain extent for the United States, is that the levels of economic interdependence between Japan and China, and for that matter, the whole production chain that runs through Asia, are now so large and so clearly the driver of Japan's growth, to the extent to which it has any growth, that it's impossible to avoid that reality. Secondly, the Japanese are not driven so much by a desire to subordinate themselves to the Chinese, but they are seeking to compete, if you will, with the Chinese for leadership in Asia. The promotion of ideas of Asian regional integration, which is not new in Japanese policy, it goes back to the 1970s. LDP governments, including the last 3-4 LDP cabinets, starting with Koizumi and going through Taro Aso and Abe and Fukuda, all of them advocated to some degree some form of East Asian community organization. Some were explicit about including the United States. Some were actually not including the United States. So this is not actually a new formulation. I think what's different on the part of the DPJ is that they were much less wedded to the security structure of the United States as it is. The LDP was always very careful, even when promoting Asian regional integration, to not to challenge the underlying security structure and the base structure and all of the force deployments that are associated with that with the United States. The DPJ was not that careful in that regard, and there's no doubt there are people in the DPJ who entertain the idea that they could significantly reduce the forward deployment of U.S. forces in Japan. Not all of them, but certainly some of them. So that combination, I think, was disturbing to a lot of people in Washington. I think the other thing to understand about this is that, the underlying Sino-Japanese rivalry hasn't been altered, I think, in any way. This is one of the most profound rivalries, I think, in international politics. It's not going to change. The desire on the part of the Japanese policymakers that were driving this shift in focus is that they really had decided that a containment strategy towards China was simply not viable, and that they had to deal with China by forcing them out into a larger regional structure. And some forms of engagement were essential to being able to bring the Chinese into a place where they could deal with them a little more easily, because I think the Japanese in the long run see that they are going to end up as the third largest economy in the world and the second largest economy in Asia, and there's no way to stop that. So the idea is to pull China out and force them to deal with the rest of Asia. I think that the idea that the Japanese are seeking somehow or other to subordinate themselves to a Sino-centric East Asia has very little basis in fact. But I recognize that perception is there. So I think that these elements that led to this problem, unfortunately, are not going to go away, even with the change in prime minister. I know there's a belief in Washington that the problem largely lay in the inept leadership of Mr. Hatayama and Mr. Ozawa's insistence on subordinating policy to the needs of domestic politics. I think the lesson that's been learned by the current DPJ leadership is not to say certain things that irritate Americans. It's a lesson the LDP learned over many, many years. If you want to say no, the best way to say it is to say, let's form a study group and look at this issue a little bit more. never say no directly. It's the passive-aggressive form of foreign policy, which Japanese governments practiced quite successfully for long periods of time. As an observer of the U.S.-Japan trade talks for many years, I can testify to that. But I think that the current leadership has certainly learned that they have to be careful about what they say. I think Mr. Khan is clearly a much more decisive leader than Mr. Hatayama. But a lot will depend for them, first of all, on how the elections go in July. He may end up being stronger or weaker. We'll see. And they're going to have to deal with the same issues of domestic politics in Okinawa and beyond that the previous government did. And they're no more willing to roll over their domestic political constituents than Mr. Hatayama and Mr. Ozawa were. They're just going to do it a little more carefully, and they're going to try and deal with the Americans a lot more carefully. And the other thing I would point out, just to conclude, is that, I'm trying to figure out a way to say this nicely, but I think American perceptions of Japan, I find sometimes are based entirely on a conversation we seem to be having with ourselves, and not much based on a conversation we're having with Japanese themselves. The key group of people in this new cabinet, that is Mr. Khan, the Chief Cabinet Secretary, Sengoku, and the new Party Secretary General, Edano. These are people who've been very close comrades, and I use the term comrades very specifically, for a long period of time, going back to the early 90s, even before that in the case of Khan and Sengoku. They, as I said, they do not come out of the LDP. They come out of a different place in Japanese politics. And if people in the United States believe that this is sort of now everything is okay and we've sort of gone back to business as usual, they're going to be in for some surprises down the road. I don't know when that will happen, but I'm pretty sure it will happen because they don't have fundamentally the same outlook as the previous governments do. In fact, they're even farther down the road in some sense of an Asianist shift in Japanese policy than Mr. Hatayama and Mr. Ozawa were. So let me stop there.
Thanks, Dan.